Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the first Majlis of this academic year. And the fact that I started the recording shows already some novelties. And so we are experimenting a bit of with a new format this year. And it is that the Majlis will be made of 3 parts. The first part is will be dedicated to the person who is presenting, in the sense that they will present their own trajectory. And this is something I've been thinking of for quite long. And the idea is that we all have to put up into the cloud an icon of ourselves, into the cloud of the internet, which is literally an icon, our best possible picture with our best possible achievements. And this is, of course, a true image, because we did achieve those things, but it's really just the peak of the mountain, and the icon is on that peak. And it can be very intimidating especially for younger scholars to see these icons, because one would assume that these icons were just born there. Now, this is really not the case. We all know. So and well, they would see us like superheroes. Now, it is true that we are superheroes in surviving in academia, flourishing in academia. But all superheroes are interesting, because behind a superhero there is a real hero. And I asked all of our guests to reveal as much as they want from this real hero, who is a human being, who is vulnerable, who has their dreams and failures and fears and joys and ways to overcome them. So that will be the first part. Basically, what we will do is to bring the after talk dinner table discussion before the talk. And it depends on the person, whether how much they want to reveal, also whether they want to record this bit. And Mehdy kindly agreed to record it. And then we will, the presentation of themselves will lead into the presentation of their own research and research history. And then that will introduce the talk itself, which will be, I think in all cases, recorded. And then the third part will be the session for questions, and that bit we won't record. So you will be free to ask whatever you would like to ask, and know that this is not going to appear online. So that's I think must be relieving for everyone, speakers and people who want to ask questions. And also, well, it's also a way to incentivize people coming in spite of the fact that the talks will be recorded, the discussion won't, and the discussion is always immensely interesting. So people shouldn't miss that. That should come live. Okay, so that's the presentation of the new format. And then I will very shortly introduce Mehdy, and then he will introduce himself. So I met Mehdy at a talk of his, which was an online talk, but he thought that it didn't go very well, because someone from the audience was asking perhaps nasty questions. And then I actually knew that the talk went very well, because I was the person who was asking the questions. So I really liked the talk, and that's why I was asking questions. Shouldn't I? If I didn't like it, I wouldn't have bothered. Now, luckily, we met again at another conference in person, and then we had a discussion. And he told that partly inspired by these nasty questions, he continued working on his paper. And then I asked him, well, would you like to present the revised version? And he kindly agreed. And he was also incredibly brave to be the guinea pig or guinea lion of this new series with this new format, for which I'm incredibly grateful to him. Mehdy, I will be silent, and please start.
Thank you very much, Istvan, for this very kind introduction and for inviting me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And a big word of thank you to you all for being here, for making up time to actually come and listen to me today. So first of all, I have to correct you on one point. You didn't ask any nasty questions, only helpful and constructive questions. So I enjoyed a lot my interaction with the audience at the Israeli Academy of Sciences. Was it in June or July? In July, I think. And yes, it was, the reason I felt uncomfortable was because I was presenting online to an audience who were there in the room. So it felt like I was speaking to a void. And that was why I was in the main feeling uncomfortable. But I absolutely enjoyed the interaction with the audience, including like the questions I was asked, the very helpful and let's say guiding questions, including yours. And thank you very much for the questions, because I didn't recognize you actually from that distance. So I didn't know who it was who was asking me questions. I'm sorry about that, but later on I found out that it was you. Anyhow, thank you very much again for inviting me here. So I've been asked to first start with a bit of self-deprecation, it seems, as Istvan already told you, and then followed by some self-aggrandizement. So, voila. It's usually like, I mean, when colleagues, people who are in academia or things like that, maybe in a business or something like that, you don't ask people how you got into this business. Like, I'm a taxi driver, I don't know, shop owner or something like that. But in academia, the first question we usually ask from people is, how did you end up doing this? Why made you interested in this subject or something like that? So I think it's only suitable for me to actually start saying a few words about how I ended up doing what I'm doing right now. So I have to say that, well, from a very early age, I was on the one hand interested in history in particular, and on the other interested in academic inquiry. I was a very inquisitive child, and I was interested in academic inquiry, making inquiries of all kinds, finding out about different issues, different things. I would just spend the summers like I'm reading books about all and sundry. And I thought it would be the only fulfilling, actually, let's say, trajectory for my future would be something that involved a lot of question asking and finding answers to those questions, or rather trying to find answers to those questions. And I was also, among other things, very much interested in history. But then at high school, I opted for a different track. So I grew up actually in Iran. I come from a very small town in the north of the country, and the province is called Gilan. So my hometown is not very far from the southern coast of the Caspian Sea. And I grew up there. And there, like, I mean, in Iran, you usually have the option of further specializing in a theme at high school. So I ended up doing something which is called math and physics, mathematics and physics, which you usually follow to study either engineering or natural sciences. And I wanted to do natural sciences. Like, I mean, that was also, let's say, a contentious decision when I decided to actually opt for physics and started studying physics at college. My family, friends, mentors, teachers, everyone was indignant at me because, like, I'm even doing natural sciences, but by doing natural sciences in a country like Iran, you're not supposed to get a good job or something like that. You're supposed to do engineering, something like that, or if you're in a different, like, I'm trajectory, then maybe medical sciences, law, or something like that. But other than that, you have to, like, do engineering. If you're doing this, following this track, then you have to do engineering. but I decided to do physics instead. So I started enrolling in a bachelor's program in physics at the University of Tehran. I ended up there like I'm following the program for 4 years, but I didn't finish, not even after 4 years. That's the let's say the minimum length of a bachelor's program in Iran. It still is. And I couldn't actually finish the program in 4 years. And then I had lots of problems, financial problems, other problems. And eventually I realized that I wasn't actually going to be able to actually finish my studies. So I decided to drop out. I dropped out, I abandoned everything. I went back to my hometown. And then I started thinking to myself that what I'm going to do from now on. So obviously, I had several options, very obvious options. Either I would find myself a job and start making a living and forget about all my academic dreams and ambitions and everything. Or I would start enrolling in a different program, or maybe even in another physics program, again, starting anew. Or I would do a combination of the two, meaning that I would try to, make a living on the one hand, doing some kind of day job or something like that. And then on the other hand, also trying to, do some studying or something like that. And this probably was the let's say, more radical decision which I made, because I decided to actually do a day job on the one hand, and on the other, start studying on my own. So I started studying on my own without enrolling in at a university again or something like that. And I was always interested in history. So I decided that I should actually start reading up on history, and in particular Middle Eastern history. But why history in particular? Why not something like physics or something like that? On the first hand, I just dropped out of physics. That was a failure. And I didn't want to do anything with that failure anymore. On the other hand, the other problem was that I was, if you study physics, you need a lot of equipment, laboratories, access to very expensive laboratories, and things like that. So you cannot do something like that on your own. But if you pursue an academic discipline like history, if you don't do archaeology or anything that requires field work or something like that, you could do it in your study, provided that you've got access to the resources, to books, to material, and to everything. So I decided to do history, and in particular Middle Eastern history. Why? Not Middle Eastern history, but generally, anything that, broadly speaking, let's say, could be described as Near Eastern, including Ottoman history and that kind of thing. Why that? Well, I had several advantages. I was a native speaker of Persian, so I knew one of the required languages. I had some Arabic. That was another one of the languages that you could actually use for doing work of that kind. While if I were, for example, to do medieval European history, on the one hand, the field was completely saturated, is saturated. It's difficult to do anything in medieval European history, anything new or original these days in medieval European history on the one hand. And on the other, I would have needed to start learning Latin or something like that, which was not really easy, wouldn't have been feasible for me to do in a span of 1 year or 2 years or something like that, and then acquire the experience of having worked with manuscripts and that kind of thing, because that takes time, and we don't have too many Latin manuscripts, let's say. It's not a secret that we don't have too many Latin manuscripts in Iran or something like that, though they are available online, many of them, of course. So I decided to actually do Middle Eastern history, partly because of this reason, partly, and this actually something I discovered later on. I thought, libraries around me were more likely to have books which had to do with Middle Eastern history. But then I also discovered that when it comes to medieval Middle Eastern history, almost anything you need in Arabic is available online. And that was, let's say, a great privilege to have access to the internet. I wouldn't have been able to do this back in the day, but nowadays, thanks to the internet, I could access virtually any kind of primary source material in Arabic I required for my work. So I started doing that. and everything was available online. Like, I mean, when it came to secondary literature, it was very difficult, like more difficult, let's say. So there are, there are like, I mean, ways of getting hold of material online. And I also had lots of friends who were affiliated with different universities, had online access to material they could share with me. And I would sometimes ask them to help me with the acquisition of certain ebooks or articles or things like that. And on the other hand, there were also some friends who were so generous as to give freely of their time and scan some material which I didn't have access to for me and send them to me, provided that, like, I mean, I wouldn't do it all the time, but if I like needed something that was absolutely indispensable to my work, and then on the other hand, also, well, I couldn't access it online or something like that, I would ask a very kind and generous friend to actually scan it for me or something like that. And then there are also, like, I mean, well, let's say lectures, online groups, and those kinds of things where people share these kind of material with each other. So that was another venue for acquiring material which wasn't otherwise accessible to me. So I started doing this. I started reading up on, let's say, pre-modern Middle Eastern history, Near Eastern history, let's say. And then eventually I became interested in early Islamic history in particular. Why was that? I became, let's say, exposed to the work of Patricia Crone and Martin Hines. So the first time I heard of the so-called revisionist or skeptical school of early Islamic history was when I heard of Patricia Crone and Martin Hines' God's Caliph, which is a very interesting book. And I realized that, well, the story I was hearing, not only from God's Caliph, then I started looking up their profiles, their publications, and everything. And I became more acquainted with and interested in the work of the late Patricia Crone. And I realized that, well, the story I was hearing was very different from the story that I had actually heard in my history courses at school growing up in a Muslim majority country like Iran. So the story I got there was the traditional story, of course, but then the story I was hearing from these academics was a totally different story, which had very little to do with what I had heard at school and from others and read in books myself, for myself. So this was really different, and this was really truly interesting. And I realized that, well, this field is at the cusp of a revolution. And that's not something you find every day here and there, and in different disciplines. So, like, I mean, you have revolution every, like, I don't know, on average, every 100 years, half a century, something like that. But here we were at the cusp of revolution. And I was like, this is very interesting. And I want to be part of this game because there's still something left to do in early Islamic history, it seems. And before long, before I even realized, I was spending most of my days reading up books and articles on early Islamic history. And to cut a long story short, after a while, I started forming some ideas of my own. I was reading too much, and I was like, well, if I take this different angle to this problem, or well, there is some evidence here in this manuscript for an let's say later dating of this text or earlier dating of this text. So what do I do with these ideas? And by that point, I was already in touch with some specialists. And I talked to them about them. They gave me encouragement. They told me that my ideas sounded interesting and I could try and write them down, which I did eventually. And eventually, some of the pieces I put together, from their point of view, were good enough to be for me to try and submit them to academic journals. So I eventually ended up submitting some of these material to academic journals for publication, and I got accepted so once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. And then I started thinking to myself that, well, it's true that the peer review process is not flawless. It can go wrong. But if you get accepted for publication once, twice, 3 times in a row, then maybe you're up to something. Maybe you're not completely wrong. Maybe you're not insane or seeing up things, imagining things. So I thought to myself that, well, then maybe I'm up to something, and I seem to be better at doing history than I was at doing physics. So maybe, and I like this, so maybe I can actually continue doing this. So I decided to continue doing that. But then again, well, there was this problem of there being a disconnect in my life between my day job. I was freelancing, working as a freelancer and making peanuts as a freelancer. Well, many of you are probably familiar with that stage of one's life when one has to make ends meet somehow. And then, well, different problems. You are probably most of you are all too familiar with it. So I was making peanuts as a freelancer on the one hand, and then spending the what was left of my time doing research on my own. And I was like, okay, it would be much better if I could actually get back to mainstream academia and well, get better access to resources, be in touch with a community of like-minded fellows, peers. And on the other hand, also, if also, if possible, well, have a salary as an academic or something like that, so that I wouldn't have to, spend part of my time doing something different, something I didn't enjoy doing. So, well, to cut a long story short again, I eventually ended up getting a position as a researcher PhD candidate at Leiden University in the Netherlands within the framework of a project called Keepers of the Flame, the transformation of the Zoroastrian priesthood in late Sasanian and early Islamic times, led by Professor Abdi Jung, the professor of comparative religion. And he was, among others, looking for a PhD candidate to work on the early Islamic period part of the project, to take care of the early Islamic period part of the project. And well, he thought that I would be a good candidate for that position. So he kindly actually agreed to take me in as a student. And in Leiden, fortunately enough for me, we've got a set of exemptions criteria, which stipulates that if you can prove that you are capable of conducting independent academic research, some of the requirements for enrollment in a PhD program may be waived for you. So I showed my publication record and CV to the dean and to the faculty, and they agreed to waive the requirements of an MA for enrollment in a PhD program for me. And then I ended up starting a PhD at Leiden, which I'm still doing, and hopefully, I'm going to submit sometime soon in the coming month. And yeah, here I am now talking to you, and well, sort of in a, let's say, more stable situation, but well, at least academically, let's say, in terms of academic track. And then on the other hand, well, Istvan also wanted me to talk about my research interests. So, and how I actually ended up doing what I'm doing now and what I'm going to present to you today. So it's obvious that, well, I'm interested in Islamic origins because, like I said, I started doing early Islamic history. And this is how I ended up working, let's say, on different aspects of early Islamic history. I didn't have a particular, let's say, interest in one aspect of the history of this period, or any period for that matter, at the expense of the other aspect. So I am as interested, let's say, for example, in economic history as I am in political history. And I'm as interested in intellectual history and history of ideas as I am in, let's say, religious history. So that sometimes puts me in a unique position. So sometimes I have too many things to, let's say, look at or take care of at the same time. And sometimes the amount of evidence, the amount of stuff I need to work with, take care of, is just unwieldy. It becomes unwieldy. It becomes very difficult to take hold of. But then on the upside, sometimes you get, well, a vision of things which gives you a better idea sometimes of what was going on. So I was talking to a colleague several months ago about, for example, what we can find in the Quran, which we can find in the Quran, which has yet to do with the state building. And he was a scholar of the Quran. And he was like, well, I'm not really qualified to comment on issues of a state building, but I take your word for it. And you would be qualified to do this because you're both interested in state building on the one hand and in Quranic studies on the other. And then we've got scholars who work, of course, on state building in early Islam, but they are not as much interested in studying the Quran and the study of the Quran. Like, I mean, they're historians of early Islam primarily, rather than scholars of the Quran. So not having the combination of the two specialities sometimes puts you at a disadvantage here. But my broader interest sometimes gives me an edge there. Although it sometimes gives me a disadvantage, disadvantages me as well, because it's sometimes very difficult to let's say, be in command of all the material and be on top of everything all the time. So sometimes I hear about, like, I mean, a piece of evidence I hadn't heard before, and I was supposed to know about it, but then I realized that, okay, I forgot about this, or I missed this, and I start feeling embarrassed and that kind of thing. But there are upsides that come with this approach as well, and with a broader interest as well. And then, yes, I let's say started with the Quran. Actually, the first article I got accepted for publication, and the first one which appeared in print was an article on the Quran, on a particular Quranic word. We are going to see it later today, actually, in my presentation as well, which I argued meant gentile, based on a corpus linguistic analysis of a corpus of early traditions. So, and in addition to that, then I did some stuff on some eschatological traditions which pertain to early Islamic history, contained then two prophecies pertaining to early Islamic history. So in order to actually figure out what was going on in them, I had to, let's say, go through a lot of sources for the political history of the earliest stages of the what we call the Second Muslim Civil War, in the years between 680 to 692, to see what was actually going on, to try and, let's say, identify the historical references in the event to prophetic part of this text I had. And then, well, I ended up with a lot of evidence for other things as well. I started taking notes, and then the notes actually constituted the material for a monograph project. They became, like, I mean, I started writing up on it. It became too large, over 100 pages, and people told me that even, like, I mean, at that length, some parts needed further elaboration. So I decided to turn it into a monograph. So this is one monograph in the works now on the Second Muslim Civil War, which I'm working on. Well, I haven't been working on for a while now. I've got more urgent issues demanding my attention, including my PhD dissertation. But I'm going to get back to it afterwards. And then, like, I mean, I started, like, taking an interest in other issues as well. I became more interested in epigraphic evidence and numismatics. So I started doing Arab-Syrian numismatics as part of this project. I realized that there was a lot of there were a lot of coins in the name of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, a figure many of you are probably very familiar with, but dating to before the date according to literary sources when he was he received the Pledge of Allegiance Caliph. So the coins dated to the reign of the previous Caliph, and I was like, okay. And then I had literary evidence for some of his activities prior to his own appointment as Caliph as well. And I thought it would be, let's say, not appropriate to correctly dismiss the numismatic evidence in the light of the literary evidence. So, but I looked at the numismatic literature, I realized that most numismatists had studied these specimens, these extant specimens in isolation. And once taken together, the totality of the evidence actually pointed to some actual minting of coinage in the name of Ibn Zubayr in southern Iran in this period, and the reign of the Caliph Yazid ibn Muawiyah. So already then, Ibn Zubayr had followers in Iran who were who were minting coins in his name. And then I started putting together the evidence. And in the process, I had to teach myself how to read the inscriptions on Arab Sasanian coins in Middle Persian. And then that's how I actually became more involved with numismatics. And then on the other hand, I realized that there was a lot of evidence in the form of inscriptions, epigraphic material, and then I started working with them as well. And then more recently, papyri as well. I've become more interested in papyri. I'm editing a papyrus fragment. I'm going to show a photo of it to you later today, and some other similar issues. But yes, I think how I came to actually this specific topic would be best actually described in the process of my talk. So I think it's enough here, and I can stop right here. And then Istvan.
Well, thank you very much, Mehdi. It was, I think, immensely interesting. I will just say two things before you continue with the actual talk. One is something what I forgot, and it's that today is World Mental Health Day, and that's why I am wearing yellow, because that that was also I think really a good day to start this sort of conversation, this sort of beginning for the Majlis. That's one thing. The other is just one to summarize somehow in one point something from your trajectory. We have someone who studied for a BA in physics, didn't complete the BA, so no BA, not only no MA, but no BA. and he's completing his PhD, and he's at the level where his publication record would be very good for a much higher academic position already. So it's, well, God's ways are really unpredictable, as
yeah,
as
I have to
we
actually
say.
say something about my education as well, because although I didn't finish my bachelor's degree in physics, I learned a lot in those 4 years. So I also took courses, audited courses in the history and philosophy of science. So I learned a lot, about humanities, the broader issues that humanists were interested in as part of those courses. And also, I was always interested in deeper questions which had to do with the epistemology of knowledge and those kinds of issues when studying physics. So it wasn't like I was a complete stranger to the humanities or something of the sort. But I got a very good education, despite the fact that I failed in courses and everything constantly.
But also actually studying another field can give you immense advantages to do something original, because that helps our interdisciplinary education. So if you manage to bridge the gap between what is required in one field and have something different already, that's extremely useful. Actually, my own father, he was a pharmacist, qualified as a pharmacist, but he wrote a history of world literature. So, so mostly Western literature. So these things happen.
Yes.
And yeah, Mehdi, I mute myself again. And
okay, over to the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. So let me start sharing my screen first. Let me see. Okay, so let's start. The topic I'm going to talk today, as you can see, is universal empire and supersessionist ideology at the origins of Islam. So Islam is very much a supersessionist religion, or let's say what we know as Islam is very much a supersessionist religion. And in the sense that it purports to have not abrogated, but rather superseded the previous two Abrahamic monotheistic dispensations of Judaism and Christianity, meaning according to virtually all classical Muslim authors, thinkers, theologians, according to the absolute majority of them, if not all of them, it's not acceptable for one to continue adhering to Judaism or Christianity after the coming of Islam. So Jews and Christians are supposed to convert to Islam after the coming of Islam. Otherwise, they are basically no different from infidels, from polytheists or adherents of any other non-divine religion, paganism, whatever. So this is what I mean by supersessionism. And well, like I said, classical Islam is very much supersessionist from that point of view, from that perspective. And this supersessionist overtone in Islam is very much visible from a very early period. So what you see here is a gold coin minted by the Caliph, Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik ibn Marwan in the year 79 AH, which is almost towards the end of the 7th century CE, and it's got some supersessionist declarations on it. Muhammad Rasulullah arsalahu bil-huda wa din al-haq liyudhhirahu ala ad-din kullih. Muhammad is the messenger of God, and he sent him with the guidance and the true religion so as to make it triumphant over all other religion. So according to this statement issued on the coinage of the early Islamic Empire, Islam is supposed to supplant all the other religions. And well, you do see pieces of evidence of this nature from a very early period on. And for example, there's another, let's say, monumental building from the reign of the same Caliph Abdul Malik, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and its inscriptions contain the same verses, together with some polemical verses directed against Christianity. So you see it here already in the year 72, which is 692, yes, 692 or 91, 691 CE. And yet, well, this is also, if you're interested in reading it, this is one of the specimens of very supersessionist expression or articulation of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad from an anonymous apologetic tractate dating to the 8th century. And evidence like this proliferates from the end of, towards the end of the first Islamic century and the beginning of the 2nd century. We already have a lot of evidence for supersessionist claims being made on behalf of Islam by Muslims. But there is also some evidence that points to a different tendency in a rather earlier period. For example, we have this account by a pseudonymous chronicler, or rather, let's say, it's not a pseudonymous chronicler, but rather a chronicler mistakenly attributed to Eusebius of Armenia. And it was completed around the year 660 or shortly thereafter. And it states that, well, let me read it to you based on Thompson's et al.'s translation. He, meaning Muhammad, said, with an oath, God promised this land to Abraham and his seed after him forever. And he brought about as he promised during that time while he loved Israel. But now you are the sons of Abraham, and God is accomplishing his promise to Abraham and his seed for you. Love sincerely only the God of Abraham, and go and seize your land, which God gave to your father Abraham. No one will be able to resist you in battle, because God is with you. So, well, this is basically what Eusebius is saying is that Islam originally was a mission, or the message of Islam was intended for Ishmaelites, the children of Abraham through Ishmael, and they were supposed to supplant the Israelites, basically. So Israel has fallen from divine grace. They're no longer God's elect, and because of that, because of their sins, because of their sinful activities, sinful acts, they're no longer supposed to be the inheritance of Abraham's heritage either. So Abraham's heritage, including the Holy Land, is now yours, the Ishmaelites. This is very interesting. And it was only in 1977 that two scholars, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, took up statements like this to come up with a different theory of Islamic origins. In this book, in this very, let's say, tendentious and controversial book, Hagarism, the Making of the Islamic World. So they postulated that the early Muslims, or rather the Quranic movement, was initially what they called the Judeo-Hagarine movement, which allied themselves, and they allied themselves with a group of Jews to conquer the Holy Land, to reclaim the Holy Land. And well, of course, many aspects of the book received a lot of pushback on the part of other scholars. And over the course of time, even the two authors of the book, Michael late Patricia Crone, distanced themselves with many aspects of the claims they made in this book. Yet, later on, we had some other publications of a different nature. Not exactly the same, totally different actually, but there's a connection here. So basically, according to Crone and Cook, early Islam was an ethno-religious movement meant for Ishmaelites, or rather Hagarines, as they call it, from Ishmael's, the name of Ishmael's mother, Hagar. And it was an ethno-religious movement, an ethnic movement, but also a religious movement. And that it was only afterwards that Islam became a universalist movement. They don't say much about, so far as I can remember, they don't say much about the transition to universalism, but that's the idea, that only classical Islam, it's the classical Islam that as we know it, that is universalist. And the Quranic movement was initially an ethno-religion. And then many years later, in 2010, Fred Donner came up with a different thesis. From his point of view, early Islam emerged as quite the opposite, not as an ethno-religious movement, but as quite the universalist movement. It was supposed to be, or the Quran's message was supposed to be for everyone, basically Muhammad's community of Ishmaelites. Well, he doesn't talk about Ishmaelites in the book. That's my word for it. Muhammad's community of Arabs, or whatever you want to call it, as well as Jews and Christians, and they all together were supposed to constitute an ecumenical community of believers. Again, Fred Donner's thesis proved to be very contentious as well, for obvious reasons, the chief amongst which being that the Quran contains many polemical exchanges of Judaism and Christianity, even where there are no direct attacks on particular Christian Jewish doctrines, like the doctrine of the Trinity. There are statements which intimate that the Quran's messenger, the Quran's enunciator, is not very happy with Christian and Jewish practice and belief. So how are we to take account of that? To take that into account, Donner does not explain. And then slightly later, in 2019, Mohsen Goudarzi published an 7-page long article or something like that, a very long article, almost a monograph, on the same subject again, the nature of the early Islamic movement, or rather the Quranic movement, in which he claimed that he eventually leaves the door open for some modicum of universalism, but doesn't elaborate on that. And the main argument is that the Quran considered Muhammad's community to be the descendants of Ishmael, and as Ishmaelites, the Quran's message was intended for them and solely for them. So again, back to the ethno-religious thesis. In a very different iteration than Krone's and Cook's, but again, Islam is made out to be an ethno-religious movement in this publication. So we've got two main competing theses about the origins of Islam. Did it emerge as an ethno-religion, or did it emerge as a universalist movement. And if it emerged as an ethno-religion, so what do we do about with its engagement with Judaism and Christianity? So how do we take that into account? If it's only meant for Ishmaelites or Hagarenes or Arabs or whoever, then why is so much interest in talking to Jews and Christians, to reaching out to Jews and Christians? And if it's the other way around, if it's a universalist message, why we've got statements to the effect that, well, for example, different verses, we are going to see them in due course in this presentation, different verses which state that Muhammad is God's messenger, or rather the Quran's messenger, whoever that may be. I believe it's Muhammad, but some people, well, anyhow, that's a topic for another day. The Quran's messenger is actually said to have been a messenger to a particular ethnic community. So why do we get statements like that? And how we reconcile these two different pictures that we get from the Quran, and which has led different scholars to different and vastly or diametrically opposed conclusions. So let's start with the notion of a nation in this sense of natio and ethnos, an ethnic community, or ummah in Arabic and the Quran. So every ummah, every community, ethnic community, every natio has got a messenger of its own in the Quran. So there are some verses here. There's a messenger for each nation. Very clearly indicated that each nation has got a messenger of its own. Quran 10:47. Indeed, we have appointed a messenger in each nation. So nations and prophets come hand in hand, basically. For indeed, before you, we sent messengers to nations. The implication is that Muhammad is also a messenger sent to a specific nation. The implication of this verse. Every nation has strived to seize hold of their messenger. Again, every nation has got a messenger whom they have strived to seize hold of. And so much so that this entanglement of prophethood or the sending of messengers with nations is so strong that even the division of humanity into different ethnic communities is intimated to have been an effect, a byproduct of God sending different prophets to different groups. The people were one nation. Then God sent the prophets to bring good tidings on war. So, and these nations and their messengers come in succession. We thus sent you to a nation before which nations had passed. So Muhammad is again, it's implied that Muhammad is sent to one specific nation. Do you not take heed how many a generation we blotted out before you on account of their sins and raised up another generation in their lieu? We then sent our messengers in succession. Whenever the nation's prophet went to them, they rejected him. We gave Moses the book, and we sent messengers one after the other after him. So messengers and nations come in succession, and each nation has got one messenger of their own. And the Quran's message here, it is explicit or most explicitly stated that is intended for one particular nation which hasn't been recipients of divine communications heretofore. This is a scripture we revealed, lest you say the scripture had only been sent to two groups, obviously Jews and Christians are intended here, ta'ifatain, before us, and we were ignorant of their teachings. And then here we have more evidence as to who this nation might have been. So the second verse you see quoted here is a verse which is ascribed, or a statement which is ascribed to Abraham and Ishmael. They make this statement, they make this prayer, utter this prayer according to the Quran, while raising the foundations of the Meccan sanctuary, the Kaaba. Raise from our progeny a nation or Ummah submitted to you, our Lord, and send a messenger to them from among themselves to read your signs to them and teach them the book and the wisdom and purify them. And then later on, in a different Quranic verse, we have this statement: He is the one who sent a messenger to the Gentiles, or meaning members of this Ummah, from among themselves, to read his signs to them and purify them and teach them the book and the wisdom. So obviously the Quran's messenger, who is referred to in the verse above, as the fulfillment of the prayer that Abraham and Ishmael make for God to send a messenger to their progeny from among their own ranks. So Muhammad's community are Ishmaelites, the descendants of Abraham and Ishmael. And Muhammad, as a prophet, sent to Ishmaelites specifically. So it seems that the Quran is meant to be a message. The Quran's message is sent to be exclusively meant for people, meaning Ishmaelites, who had not received any divine messages before this. But then again, we find contradictory statements, what seems to be contradictory statements in the Quran. Those who follow the messenger, the Gentile prophet, and Nabi and Al-Ummi, who they find mentioned with them in the Torah and the Gospel, say, O people, I am the messenger of God to you all. And then the Quran also legislates for Jews and Christians and orders them to avoid certain things or do certain things. And then again, the Torah and the Gospel are still binding scriptures from the point of view of the Quran, despite the fact that they have accrued themselves some satanic interpolations. So there are some false pericopai, satanic interpolations, whatever you want to call them, and the Torah and the Gospel. So the Torah, from the point of view of the Quran, is the scripture that God sent to Moses and for the Israelites, and the Gospel in the singular as a book, as a scripture that God sent to Jesus. And these are still binding scriptures. So what can we conclude from this? Well, apparently the ambit of Muhammad's message all of a sudden includes Jews and Christians as well. The Quran legislates for Jews and Christians, but at the same time, the Quran never claims to have abrogated the Torah and the Gospel. So the message of the Quran seems to be universalist, or have become universalist in the course of time and the course of its messenger's career, if we assume, with this caveat, that if we assume that the Quran in its totality goes back to one enunciator, one final enunciator. So these two scriptures are still binding. So it seems that the ambit of the message has become universal by this point, at a certain point in time, but it does not claim to have superseded the previous dispensations, Judaism and Christianity, because the Torah and the Gospel are still binding scriptures. They can be consulted, they can be read, and Jews and Christians are free to practice, or rather, let's say, to keep calling themselves Jews and Christians, meaning that no formal conversion, no formal giving up of their religion is required of them. If you're a Jew, you're not supposed to stop calling yourself a Jew and start calling yourself something new. For example, believer, Muslim, or something like that. So the only demand that the Quran makes of Jews and Christians is to give up the falsehoods, the aberration that has accrued into their religions in the course of time, and to start practicing the original, pure, and authentic form of their own religions. So basically, the message that the Quran is bringing for Ishmaelites, for whom it counts as a new religion, is no different from the message that Jews and Christians have received before the Ishmaelites. Only that Jews and Christians have aberrated in the course of time, and it's the Quran's duty, it's the duty of the Quran's messenger to bring them back to the original form of their religions. In other words, you have a universal message here, but non-supersessionist. It's universal insofar as it includes everyone within the horizon of the Quran's thought world. It includes Ishmaelites, Jews, and Christians, but it's not supersessionist insofar as much as it does not claim to have superseded Judaism and Christianity, and the Torah and the Gospel are neither abrogated nor superseded. They can still be consulted as binding scriptures. And Jesus here is just another, according to the Quran, is just another Israelite prophet. And in the Israelite tradition of prophecy, and so is Muhammad. And the Jews have committed some sins over the course of time. For example, the worship of the golden calf, and was Jesus' deity and they've been punished by the imposition of additional and very stringent dietary restrictions. It was Jesus' duty to give them an opportunity. Jesus was sent to the Israelites to give them an opportunity to repent for their sins by believing in him. And then those additional set of dietary restrictions would be relaxed for them. Of those Jews who actually failed to follow Jesus, failed to make use of that first opportunity, they've now got Muhammad, who's now got that duty for them. So he's also fulfilling different functions for Jews here. So if, as a Jew, you believed in Muhammad, the additional set of dietary restrictions of the second legislation and the Old Testament would be abrogated for you, because you're no longer, you have basically expiated for the sins committed by the Israelites and the episode of the worship of the golden calf, the killing of the prophets, and so on and so forth. And also Muhammad as a true prophet, but this is a long story, so let's leave it for another day. I'm just going to refer to it briefly, that Muhammad has got a different function to fulfill, and that's to remove the satanic identifier for Jews and Christians, the satanic interpolations into the Torah and the Gospel, and remove them from them. And this is what we have here by the time of the closure of the Quranic text to further additions. So by this point, whenever in time it might have been, that's again another issue for another different day. Judaism and the Quran is no longer open to further additions, and by this stage, and the development of formative Islam is a universalist, simultaneously, rather oddly, simultaneously a universalist dispensation, but also simultaneously an ethno-religion. For Ishmaelites, it's an ethno-religion. For Jews and Christians, it's a universal message for everyone. It's a universal message which also has got functions to fulfill for Jews and Christians, but it's not supersessionist. It doesn't claim to have superseded Judaism and Christianity. You could still call yourself a Jew. Well, maybe from the perspective of your former co-religionist, you no longer counted as Jewish or as Christian after doing all the things that the Quran requires of you. But still, from the point of view of the Quran, that's not giving up on your old religion. The Quran has brought back the original form of your own religion for you, and you can continue claiming to be Jewish or Christian while also believing in Muhammad as just another prophet, despite him being a Gentile in the Israelite tradition of prophecy, as well as by following his commandments concerning false practices that have accrued into Judaism and Christianity. So this is what we get from the Quran by the time the Quranic text is closed to further additions and elaborations. And yet, the classical Islam, as we know it, is by and large supersessionist, much more supersessionist than the tradition is much more supersessionist than what we get from the Quran. So when did that take place? So it's let me digress a little bit. So this book was published in 1994, if I'm not mistaken, by Khalid Yahya Blankenship, The End of the Jihad State, The Reign of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, and the Collapse of the Umayyads, in which Blankenship argued that the Umayyad state was a jihad state which was constantly on war footing with the aim of constant warfare until there was no further wars to be fought. In other words, until Islam had taken over, the Islamic State had taken over the whole world. But, well, he did not produce much evidence for this argument. He just used this as his starting assumption and was taken to task by many of his reviewers for this. Yet, I think he was up to something. We do have some evidence, most of it indirect, that the early Islamic State had universalist aspirations. For example, in early compositions, like the Kitab al-Kharaj of al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, the whole of the world is divided into the abode of Islam, or Dar al-Islam, and the abode of war, or Dar al-Harb. The term Dar al-Kufr is only the abode of infidelity, or the abode of disbelief, is only attested in later periods. It's not attested in this early period. So this, in other words, in this early period, Kuf is not granted official recognition, or the land of Kuf is not granted official recognition. You are not supposed to have anything as a land where Kuf is supposed to be allowed to exist. You only have the land of Islam, the abode of Islam, and the abode of war. So the territories under the control of the Caliphate are the abode of Islam, obviously, and the rest of the world, the parts of the world which are not under Caliphate control, which are not under Islamic control, are fair game for waging wars on. So those are territories that are yet to be conquered and bought under the authority of the Muslims. So this is one indication that the mindset was one of world conquest and the setting up of a universal empire. And then we've got eschatological traditions as well. This is a very widely attested tradition in different forms and with widely varying variants. But these are the elements in which all the variants more or less agree. And I have a feeling, I haven't yet finished doing the Snad Commat analysis, but I have a feeling that it actually goes back to let's say something around first half of the 2nd century AH Syria. A group of my community will continue to be on the right, or al-haq, victorious over all people, and no adversary will be able to do harm to them until God's affair, Amrullah, meaning the Isqtan, comes to them while they are still in that victorious state. They will be in Syria. So this is a statement attributed to the Prophet. A group of the Prophet's community, meaning Muslims, a group of Muslims will continue to be victorious, defeating everyone until the end of time. So this is the idea of an eschatological empire that we have, an eschatological universal world empire expressed in this tradition. And it is not only that empire that is going to be victorious over everyone, but also that group of Muhammad's community who are in the right, meaning just one group of Muslims, not only Muslims in general. Here Islam has not only superseded Judaism and Christianity, but you also have further subdivisions within the community itself. But I think the most important piece of evidence that points to transition from non-supersessionism to supersessionism is to be found in the physical practices of the Islamic empire. So we don't have much time, so I'm going to be brief, and I cannot present you with all the evidence pertaining to the physical history of the early Islamic empire. So I'd like to ask you to take this for granted, and from me to take my word for this until such other time as we can have a separate discussion over these issues. So after the conquests, when the Muslim armies burst out of Arabia, started conquering the whole of what is now the Middle East and some other territories in North Africa and all over the place. Of course, obviously, as we know from the papyri, from other pieces of evidence, they started taxing the conquered populations. Usually, according to classical Islamic orthodoxy and according to chronicles, the taxes were paid by non-Muslims to the Muslims. But well, one could also think differently about the issue, that actually it wasn't non-Muslims paying taxes to Muslims, but it just so happens that the conquerors were all what we now call Muslims. They were part of the same movement, the same community that we now call Islam. It was actually conquerors taxing the conquered. And then after a while, we had conversion. People converting to Islam and demanding the same rights as the old believers, including enjoyment from the benefits of the conquest. So the conquerors collected taxes. The taxes went towards the payment of stipends to the conquerors. And then you had converts converting to Islam and then wanting to also benefit from these conquest revenues. And this caused a lot of problems. And this is actually widely tested in the historical sources and the chronicles dating pertaining to Umayyad history, that there was a lot of social contention, people converting to Islam, moving to garrison towns, demanding to join the ranks of the conquest society, but failing to do so because the Umayyad state was unable to accommodate all of them. And then what happened as a result? Eventually, a different conceptualization of how things were supposed to work emerged. And the first vestiges of this different conceptualization can be seen in what scholars know as the fiscal rescript of the Caliph Umar II. So, well, this is also a story for a different day, for another day, but I believe this text is actually an authentic declaration, an edict promulgated by the Caliph Umar II. And in it, he tries to address these social issues. So there were lots of people converting to Islam, wanting to join the conquest society, but they were turned away by the conquerors, but by Umayyad state officials, because the Umayyad state was unable to accommodate all of them, and they were causing a lot of headache for everyone because of that, because they still insisted on being accommodated. So another thing that I'd like to ask you to accept from me for the time being, this is also rather well attested, but here and there in the secondary literature, that hijrah in this context means movement to garrison towns and being allowed to settle there. And given the evidence of the papyri and also the older stratum of legal literature on taxation manuals, the muhajirun, the ones who make the hijrah, the ones who settle in the garrison towns, are to be entitled to revenues of the conquest, to the tax revenues. So they are to receive stipends. Hijrah entitles you to receiving the stipends. So what does the Caliph say here? وَيُفْتَحَ لِأَهْلِ الْإِسْلَامِ بَابُ الْهِجْرَةِ. So this is one of the things you see it in the bottom line as well. That the doors of hijrah, settling in garrison towns, meaning settling in garrison towns, are to be opened up for the Ahlul Islam, the people who have converted to Islam, or the Muslims in general, the Muslim community in general. So there were two categories. This presumes that there were two categories of Muslims. One, a group who were enjoying from the benefits of the hijrah. The other, a group, obviously, given the evidence of the chronicles, the converts, the new converts, the neophytes, who were denied these benefits. So Umar is reconceptualizing the whole system. So now, instead of just settlers or conquerors benefiting from the tax revenues, anyone converting to Islam was allowed to move to the garrison towns and benefit from the tax revenues of the conquests. Anyone who converted to Islam. So from here on, we have, from this point on, we have a new system starting to establish a foothold. So again, another story for another day. Umar II's reform eventually failed, and but the same mindset eventually took over at the end of the Umayyad period, after the fall of the Umayyads, when the Abbasids took power. So we have a different system trying to establish a foothold here, according to which it's not movement to and settling garrison towns that entitles one to tax revenues, to benefiting from tax revenues, but rather it's conversion to Islam that entitles you to benefiting from those revenues. So there is a stark contrast here being made between the let's say legal and fiscal status of Muslims and non-Muslims, and eventually there's a complete transition to a system, at least on the theoretical level, a complete transition to a system whereby Muslims are supposed to be the beneficiaries. The entire Islamic community is supposed to be the beneficiaries of the conquest revenues, and the ones who are supposed to uphold the system by paying taxes are the non-Muslims. And this is how further differentiation between the two groups materializes. And I think this is the point where by this point, we can definitely confidently claim that religious boundaries have become more and more concrete between different religious groups here by this point. And when we see a transition to supersessionism, so this is from around the year 100. This tradition is also from the early 2nd century, and Abu Yusuf is just one generation after the Umayyads. So this all points to major developments in the later 1st and early 2nd century. And this must have been when the transition from non-supersessionism to supersessionism actually took place. And I'd like to present you that where we started, the coin bearing a supersessionist claim, a triumphalist claim that Muhammad's message is supposed to supplant all other religion. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mehdy. Yes, before switching off the recording and starting the question session, I would just say two things. One is still referring to what you said at the beginning, that's one of the reasons you started exploring this field, is that there are still so many things to discover. And I think this is really something extremely exciting in our field, that there are so many things to discover and so many things still to say about even such fundamental things that about which you have been talking. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that next week we will also have a majlis, and I'd like to advertise it right now. And it will be Rahim Gholami's majlis, which will be on the soul's fulfillment in Nasri Khosrow's The Wayfarer's Sojourn at the Banquet. So major work by Nasri Khosrow, and also, interestingly, its relevance for us all up to today. So that we are looking forward to another exciting talk. And now I will stop the recording and we will start the discussion.